The jar in your kitchen cost 12 bees their entire lives. 12 worker lives are hidden in every teaspoon. A worker honeybee lives for 6 weeks in summer. In those 6 weeks, she will fly the equivalent of 1.5 times around the circumference of the earth. She will visit between 500 and 1,000 flowers every single day. And she will produce, across the entirety of her 6-week life, approximately 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey. 1/12. 12 bees, every flight, every flower, every day of the only summer they will ever have, produce a single teaspoon. Your jar contains more than 1 teaspoon. But here is what I could not stop thinking about after I first read the research. The bees that produced it did not collect it. They transformed it inside their bodies. Through a biochemical process that has been refined across 50 million years and that begins the moment a bee lands on a flower in your garden and does not end until the day before she dies. The honey in your jar is not flower nectar. It is something that used to be flower nectar before something extraordinary happened to it. Here is what actually happened. Subscribe if this is the kind of thing that changes ordinary objects for you. The part that made me put the jar down comes later. Most people assume honey is something bees collect the way you collect rainwater. You put out a bucket, the rain fills it. The bee visits flowers, the nectar comes back to the hive, and honey is the result. Nectar in, honey out. That is not what happens. The process begins inside the bee's body the moment she lands on a flower. She draws nectar from the nectary through her proboscis and into a structure called the honey stomach, a separate organ from her actual digestive stomach, designed specifically for carrying and processing nectar. It can hold up to 40 milligrams. That sounds like a small number. It is a small number. She will make between 10 and 15 return trips to the hive today, and every trip she makes fills that honey stomach with nectar that is already beginning to change. In the honey stomach, enzymes begin working immediately. The most important is invertase, an enzyme produced in her salivary glands, which breaks sucrose, the primary sugar in nectar, into fructose and glucose. This is not the bee passively transporting something from one place to another. This is active enzymatic conversion happening inside her body while she is still flying, while she is navigating by the sun's angle, while she is managing the fuel costs of another 6 kilometers of flight. When she returns to the hive, she doesn't store the nectar, she passes it. She regurgitates the partially transformed nectar from her honey stomach and transfers it, mouth to a house bee waiting inside the hive. That house bee continues the enzymatic process in her own honey stomach, adding her own enzymes, processing the nectar further, and after some minutes, passes it on again. This chain involves multiple bees before the nectar is considered ready for the comb. You are watching a distributed chemical process that passes through individual bodies the way a river passes through a series of mills. Have you ever opened a jar of honey and wondered why it tastes like nothing else in the world? Nothing else in the world was made like this. After the chain of transfers, the processed nectar is deposited into a hexagonal wax cell. At this point, it still contains between 60 and 80% water. Honey, as we recognize it, contains less than 18% water. Getting from one state to the other is the problem the colony has to solve. And the solution is one of the stranger things I've learned about any animal. The solution is airflow. House bees station themselves beside the open cells containing fresh nectar and fan their wings continuously, not to cool the hive, but to drive air across the surface of the liquid. This evaporates water from the exposed nectar, slowly concentrating it. The fanning continues around the clock. Bees rotate in and out of fanning positions. The colony treats it as infrastructure work, the same way it treats guarding the entrance or tending the brood. The hive itself maintains a constant internal temperature of approximately 35 degrees Celsius year-round. The bees achieve this through collective vibration, adding or removing heat from the air by contracting their thoracic muscles, the same mechanism the Japanese honeybee uses to cook a giant hornet. In the honey context, that stable, warm temperature is not incidental. It is part of the evaporation system. The colony has constructed, without any blueprint, a controlled temperature drying chamber that operates continuously. When the water content drops below approximately 18%, something important happens. At that concentration, the honey becomes chemically hostile to microbial growth. It will not ferment. It will not spoil. A jar of properly sealed honey excavated from an Egyptian tomb more than 3,000 years old was tested and found to be chemically intact. The bees solved the preservation problem not by adding anything, but by removing water to a precise threshold. The bees cap the cell with wax when that threshold is reached. The cap is the signal. This portion is finished. What this means for the jar in your kitchen is that every teaspoon in it was individually monitored by bees who fanned it, tested it, and sealed it when the conditions were exactly right. There is no part of that process that was automated. There is no part of it that happened without a bee. In 1982, a researcher named Thomas Seeley at Cornell University published detailed measurements of the energy costs of honey production. The numbers are difficult to hold without stopping. To produce 1 pound of honey, a colony must collectively visit approximately 2 million flowers. They fly a combined distance of roughly 55,000 miles, more than twice the circumference of the Earth. The nectar required weighs between 3 and 5 pounds because most of its volume is lost during evaporation. The bees do not convert nectar to honey at 1-to-1. They concentrate it to roughly 1/4 of its original weight. The rest becomes air. Seeley also quantified the cost of the wax comb itself, the structure the honey is stored in. Bees must consume approximately 8 pounds of honey to produce 1 pound of beeswax. The container is more expensive to build than most people assume. What this means for the bee in your garden is that every foraging flight she makes has a specific fuel cost, a specific nectar yield, and a specific contribution to a system that operates with the efficiency of something that has been optimizing itself across an unimaginable span of time. She is not a pollinator stopping by your lavender on the way to somewhere else. She is a biochemical processing unit inside a distributed network that happens to be headquartered 3 kilometers from your house. She is doing the same thing the bee in the hive is doing, not in parallel, but as part of the same continuous operation. The factory produced the jar in your kitchen. It ran on 6 weeks of summer, multiplied by the number of teaspoons you have, multiplied by 12. Right now, while you are watching this, somewhere within 3 kilometers of where you are sitting, possibly much closer, there is a colony of between 30,000 and 50,000 bees. They are doing all of this at this moment. Foragers are landing on flowers with empty honey stomachs and leaving with full ones. House bees are receiving transfers, running the enzymatic chain, depositing nectar into open cells. Fanning bees are stationed at those cells, evaporating water, working by instinct toward a threshold they cannot measure and do not need to measure. Guard bees are checking every bee that returns to the entrance for the correct chemical signature of colony membership. The colony does not pause. There is no overnight stop, no weekly rest, no period when the system idles. There is only the next task and the bee available to do it. Out of that continuity, that unmanaged, undirected, uninterrupted sequence, comes something that sits in a glass jar in your kitchen that you probably don't think about when you reach for a spoon. I want to tell you something I have thought about more than makes sense. The bee that contributed to the honey in your kitchen had 6 weeks. That is not a metaphor. 6 weeks from first flight to the morning she didn't come back, her wings worn past the threshold of efficient flight somewhere over your garden or the one next door, and that was the end of it. In those 6 weeks, she produced 1/12 of a teaspoon. She didn't produce it to give it to you. She produced it so the colony could survive a winter she would not live to see. So 50,000 bees could eat through the months when there are no flowers and no way to make more. She was not thinking about the jar. She was solving the problem immediately in front of her. The flower, the nectar, the flight back, the transfer, the next flower. The jar is an abstraction that has no meaning inside a beehive. But the jar exists because she solved that problem, and because 11 other bees with 6 weeks each did the same, and because hundreds of others fanned what they brought back, and because other hundreds capped the cells at exactly the right moment. Your jar is not a product. It is what happens when 50 million years of refinement produces a system efficient enough to have something left over. The bee that visited your garden this morning has approximately 5 weeks remaining. Some portion of what she collects today, processed, fanned, capped by bees who will also not survive the winter, will outlast both of you by a considerable margin. I find I cannot open that jar the same way anymore. Tell me in the comments, did you know that honey never spoils? Most people have heard it. But did you know the reason, the exact water content, the 18% threshold, why that specific number makes the difference between something that lasts 3,000 years and something that ferments in a week? Tell me what you knew and what surprised you. I read everything. Subscribe. New video every week. See you next time. And if you want to understand what the bee in your garden does with the information she collected today, not the nectar, but the location of your flowers, how she carries that back, and what happens to it inside the hive tonight, that is the next one.